Revolutionary period and look at some less well-known players and who they were and how they interacted. So let's have a look. Just my sources, and these are 3 books, well, 3 of the 4 books that are up on the front table if you want to look at them afterwards. And then my book on the far right is in the library, I think. It's been sort of back and forth. Anyway, so that's the Gary Nash book on the left is just an incredible look, in-depth, 600 pages of it, at the revolution, what he calls the unruly birth of democracy and the struggle to create America. And so there's a lot on the subject of the class differences. And I'll tell you about the others as we go along. So look here at Philadelphia in 1720 and Philadelphia in 1752. In slightly more than 30 years, 70 years, the city has grown a hugely successful port city that by the time of the Revolution will be the largest in the North American colonies. So the merchants who are reaping this success, I've referred to before as the merchant elite, mainly Quakers. They're building grand houses with elegant furnishings and fine clothing and carriages. And in the terminology of the time, they were known as the upper sort. The artisans and craftsmen who made the goods that the merchants sold in London and elsewhere, mainly London, were known as the middle sort or the middling sort. And the servants and the laborers, many of whom were enslaved to the upper sort, were called the lower sort. At the top of the heap, you have the professionals and merchants, many of whom were descendants of the early Quaker settlers. As their wealth increased, the Quaker norms of modesty dictated that they shouldn't be showing it off, so many of them became Anglicans, so they couldn't. It's true. I kid you not. Christ Church, up here on the left, at 2nd and Market, was the first Anglican church in the city. It dates to 1696, with the present building dating to 1727, plus the bell tower, which was added in 1758. By the 1750s, the city had grown so much that the streets were getting crowded and developers were cutting up the large blocks with small, narrow streets and many small houses, like Elfress Alley, if you've ever been there. So the wealthier people started moving to the southern part of town and building grand houses with gardens. And so here's the map. And so this is, you can see the Market Street or High Street is at the center here. And so everything is clustered around the main street with where the food is, and then the docks where the goods are coming and going. And so people start moving down to this part of town. People such as Samuel and Elizabeth Powell, and I mentioned her in the Liberty Tale on my first time. Sorry, this mouse is acting strangely. Why are you? What is going on? Ed, this is weird. Ah, this is not working. It won't go.
That's right.
I know, but I want to be over here. Sorry.
Well, you can't get out of
Take
it.
this in your loop to remind folks to turn off their
Oh, yeah, cell phones, right.
Why?
Well, can I do fingering? No.
No, let's turn off the,
Oh, there it goes.
how do you get there? Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, the mouse has a mind of its own this morning. So people such as Elizabeth Powell and her husband Samuel, you see here in the center, and John and Elizabeth Cadwallader, who you see in this portrait by Charles Wilson Peale in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, fit into this category. A second Anglican church, St. Peter's, opened in 1761 as part of Christ Church. The interior, as you see here, is very plain, like a Quaker meeting house, perhaps designed that way to make them feel less guilty about abandoning their Quaker heritage. But this shift meant that the political power in the city, held by Quakers since William Penn's time, was now in the hands of the Anglicans. The middle sort consisted of artisans and craftsmen, as well as tradesmen and shopkeepers. If you go to the American wing of the PMA, you can see a fabulous collection of furniture and silverware created by Philadelphians, items which one no longer needed to import from London. These people would have had little or no elementary education. One had to pay for it. Then boys served as apprentices for 7 years before being employed in the given craft. The lower sort consisted of day laborers and servants, many of whom were enslaved to Philadelphians. They did the grunt work, digging ditches, working on the docks. And yes, the first sale of Africans in chains in Philadelphia took place in 1684, 2 years after Penn's arrival in the city. And by 1740, they made up 10% of the young city's population, with perhaps 1 or 2 in a household or more. The population of the city in 1765 was about 18,000, including about 1,400 enslaved people. In 1767, the wealthiest 10% of the population owned 44% of the enslaved. The poorest, 50%, owned 5%. By 1775, the population had increased to 25,000, and the slave population began to decline as people were manumitted. Samuel Carpenter, whose slate roof, I'm sorry, in the picture here, this is a slave sale taking place at the London Coffee House, the corner of Front and Market Streets. So you see that's going on just one day. And here is Samuel Carpenter's house, the slate roof house that you saw in the Liberty Tale. He owned plantations in Barbados and bought, sold, and owned slaves. The last time that, I mentioned last time that people like Benjamin Chew and John Dickinson had many provisioning plantations in Delaware and Maryland. So many of the slaves would be going there too. William Penn owned slaves. One enslaved woman, known as Alice of Dunk's Ferry, was probably born to one of the first slave arrivals and died in 1802 at age 116. Wow. She rode her horse from Bristol up on the Delaware to Christchurch every Sunday. And she remembered lighting William Penn's pipe when she was a girl. I mean, how about that? Amazing. Now try to imagine what most households were like. They were more like an economic unit than the 19th century sweet family ideal. The owner or master of the upper or middling sort would have a wife and children. Any apprentices the owner had would live there too. They were often children of friends or relations, as would the servants, indentured or enslaved. The master was in charge. His wife, the mistress, ran the household. The children and the others were called either boy or girl. Living spaces were very tight, especially if the master had his office or shop downstairs by the front door, as in the Powell house shown here. So this first floor front room was Samuel Powell's office, and then this is the grand room upstairs. This is up here. That's kind of what the social structure was. There were schools in the city for those who could pay for them, but a school which was free to enslaved boys was started by French Huguenot turned Quaker Anthony Benezet. He started a school for boys, one for girls, and night classes for enslaved people, such as Absalom Jones, who eventually became the first Black minister in the Episcopal Church. Now, I have an incredible tale to tell. Last Friday, I gave a lecture, and when I left, I went home and I stopped by my cubby, and picked up an envelope with something in it from Jane Bond, who's here this morning. Jane is up here in the front row. And it was this, you probably can't see it very well, but it's called Lettres des Amis, le bulletin des Quakers en France. Yeah, really. And I'm like, I didn't know there were Quakers in France. And so I went to Wikipedia and I found an article that was clearly written by somebody who was French, but it was in English, so it was a little fuzzy, but the story was there. So if you look at this map, there's a tiny little town called Congénie in this area right here. Now, this map is of France during the Wars of Religion. And so if you can read the key, the purple are the Huguenot lands, and the green is the Catholic, and then the yellow is what they're fighting over. And so here's this little town here, and my notes here. So in the Wars of Religion, they were, there were Protestants in this town, and so they kind of went underground, and there'd been a lot of fighting over the between the Protestants and the Catholics, and then in 1681, Louis XIV decided it was time to force people to go back to the Catholic Church. So that cartoon that's in the middle there, you see dragon missionnaire. So a dragoon. This is one of Louis XIV's soldiers, missionary, and he's pointing a gun at this bourgeois Protestant, and who is saying, force. Oh God! See, this is I can't read it yet. Force passes reason. La force passe la raison, and so it's this is what was going on, and so the Protestants went kind of underground, and some people got out, and there was one man who in the neighboring town who walked all the way to London and found for refuge, and he found a Quaker meeting there, and which is you see right here, and he got papers, information about the Quakers, and took them back and started the Quakers in the little town of Congénie. Now, somebody else from that same little town who left, and I have no idea if they were at the same time or not, was a man named Jean Benezet, who left with his wife and probably 2-year-old child in 1715 and got them to London, and then eventually to Philadelphia, and his son was Anthony Benezet. Now, any of you from Chestnut Hill probably know about Benezet Street, right? And so it's Benezet, and this is where the name came from. So it's really quite amazing. So here is Antoine, who spoke out early against the Society of Friends spoke out early against slavery. And here's the Germantown Friends meeting petition against slavery in 1688, okay, early. Benezet, and then there's Benjamin Lay that I mentioned last week. You see here in the sort of 1730s, who's railing against all slave keepers that keep the innocent in bondage are apostates. And he goes on, and it's quite a tale of his life. And then Benezet started the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1775 after much effort on the part of some Quakers like Lay, persuaded Quakers to free their slaves in 1776. Many others in this period saw the anomaly of demanding their own liberty from King George while denying it to the people who worked for them. So thank you, Jane, for putting me onto that. It was really quite wonderful. The timing was amazing. So thank you. So Benjamin Franklin was the archetype of the middle sort. As we saw in the Liberty Tale, the young printer's apprentice arrived in Philadelphia from Boston in 1723 and quickly succeeded in the trade. And he did so well that he retired from printing such things as Poor Richard's Almanac, you see here, and at the age of 45. So he could devote himself to his fascination with things scientific and especially to the betterment of his community. And here is where his house was in the 300 block of Market Street. It's now, maybe some of you have been there, but it's part of Independence National Historical Park. And they recreated the framework of his house and the interior of the block, so through this carriageway here. And last night I was kind of poring over this wonderful map that was created in 1987 for the bicentennial of the Constitution, and it marks where everybody, just where people lived, what the shops were, and so on and so forth. And I find right down here, so it would be, let's see, this is Chestnut Street coming along here. So here's Market, and then here's Chestnut. And this block, little dark block there, that's where Benezet lived. I just figured that out last night. So anyway, so one of the first things Franklin did was in 1727 to start the Club of Leather Aprons, geared to the craftsmen, which became known as the Junto. They held weekly meetings to discuss political and economic issues. By 1731, it was a political club and reading society, and the reading society then became the Library of Company of Philadelphia, which still exists today. And I just read in the paper the other day that it may become part of Temple. The most popular author that the society read was John Locke, who, as we saw last week, called for the separation of church and state. And then in his two treatises of government, he called for the liberty and social contract of equality. So, which, as we said before, had a direct influence on Thomas Jefferson. Gary Nash calls this junto a model for self-empowerment and political engagement of ordinary Philadelphians. So important, right? So where did women fit into this society? They had no rights, but they did work and speak their minds. The lower and middle sort women worked as hard as their husbands and took care of a household and children, but they had no rights. You may recall the letters between John and Abigail Adams, in which she presses him to give rights to women, to relieve them from the tyranny and domination of men. John Adams wasn't particularly listening, but anyway. A woman could, at her husband's death, take on his business, such as the widows of tavern keepers did. In late 18th century Philadelphia, there was a tavern for every 25 people. The one seen here at 2nd and Spruce Streets, called the Man Full of Trouble, is the only remaining one in the city. It has recently been restored and reopened as a tavern downstairs and a small museum upstairs, and you can go and have a drink. But keep in mind that it wasn't all just about the drinking. This was where people met. They didn't have telephones. They could read newspapers there. They could have meetings, discuss business, whatever. It was, a community meeting place. And you saw women working everywhere, such as in the market on High Street, selling their wares, like the pepper pot soup vendor here. So this self-empowerment and political engagement of ordinary Philadelphians, noted by Nash, created competition for political clout between the upper and the middle sort. The same phenomenon occurred in Boston, with John Adams' cousin Samuel emerging as a radical political leader after the 1770 Boston Massacre. And we saw last week how the Great Awakening gave the lower classes a voice, which Nash described as providing a radical model which challenged upper class assumptions about the social order. Figures such as Patrick Henry, remember him, give me liberty or give me death, were greatly influenced by the oratory of Great Awakening preachers. So how did this social structure play out and interact in the years before and during the Revolution? Radical groups were forming in other cities like New York and Boston, but in the time after the Boston Massacre, the focus in those cities was against the presence of the British in their streets. That not being the case in Philadelphia in the years before the Revolution, the focus was against the upper sort who were making money off the labor of people like them. They wanted their share of money and power mainly by being allowed to vote. After the First Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall, excuse me one sec, just have a look there. Where the skills of the local builders were on display, artisans forced a vote to allow them to be represented on the committees that were taking over the political levers of the city and to form militias or volunteer military forces. After the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, remember the Congress, First Continental Congress was fall of 74. So in the spring of 75, after Lexington and Concord, 31 volunteer militias called associators were formed in the city, made up of most of the males of fighting age, except Quakers. According to Nash, quote, the militiamen shaped an agenda for radical internal reform while practicing the use of arms. Their goals of curbing individual accumulation of massive wealth, opening up economic and political opportunities, divorcing the right to vote from property ownership, and driving the merchant elite from power became explicit in a flood of polemical literature that now swept the city. They organized their own committee of correspondence and pressured Pennsylvania's provincial assembly to take a more assertive stand on independence, and they made many demands for equality going forward. The upper sort were appalled at what the riffraff were doing, but changes were made. Another factor in their broad appeal in the working class was the inclusion of people from the variety of religious groups in the city, thanks to William Penn. So here you see the Carpenter's Hall and where the Congress took place. So now I want to look at a little known and less understood figure who illustrates the conflict between and within the Patriots. So you have the Loyalists or Tories and the Patriots or Whigs, right? So Jacob Duché was the grandson of another French Huguenot who came to Philadelphia in the late 17th century, fleeing the wars of religion in France with his wife, their 10 and a half children, and the family Bible. And that's all, nothing else. That Bible can now be found at the library company. It's fascinating to see. That one half child was born and he was Jacob Duché's father. So by the time young Jacob was born in 1737, the family was well established in the city, and his father went on to become mayor. Young Jacob attended the Academy and College of Philadelphia, which was founded by Franklin and later became the University of Pennsylvania. He went back to England. He went back to England for studies at Cambridge and was ordained in London before returning to take up the post of assistant minister of the United Churches of Christ Church in St. Peter's in 1759, the age of 22. He also became a professor of oratory at the Academy and College, and he quickly became admired for his preaching style very much like George Whitefield's The Great Awakening, and was even known for having his hair curled and powdered before he preached. Preachers in this Great Awakening era were like rock stars, and Whitfield, Franklin would print posters and put them up saying that George Whitfield was coming to town. So here's Christ Church interior and the portrait of Jacob Duché. And so here is an example of George Whitfield's preaching. This is, I can't remember if I showed you this before, but it's this amazing picture. Yeah, I think I did. The Hogarth print of a Great Awakening preacher, carrying forth, and the woman fainting on the ground below. So here's a copy of from a history of Germantown that was published in the 1870s, and I looked at it some years ago, and I can't remember who wrote it, when it was published, but I know it was like the 1870s. And to Jim, is Jim Delaplane here? I don't think so. Yeah, because he told me something about this, and I asked him. So when Whitfield visited Germantown, he preached from a little balcony to a great crowd gathered in the market square below. And in this article from a newspaper, on Friday last, Reverend Mr. Whitfield arrived here with his friends from New York, where he preached 8 times. He preached here twice every day since his arrival in the church to great crowds, except Tuesday, when he preached at Germantown from a balcony to about 5,000 people. Okay, that gives you a sense of the size, the fascination with this whole thing. And that balcony that he preached from, Jim Delaplane told me, was his ancestors. So, yeah. Jacob and Elizabeth Duché were married and moved into a large house that his father had built for him when he married her, Elizabeth Hopkinson, sister of Francis Hopkinson. He was now in charge of St. Peter's, and so is living diagonally across from the church. If you look at this painting of the house, you'll notice also that it's a stormy night, and there's a bolt of lightning coming down, and there's a man down here sort of running along. Now, I don't see a kite, but it is believed to be a picture of Franklin and his kite. So, and Duché, of course, knew Franklin, and he was much younger, but he had gone to the college that Franklin started. So, he was certainly well known to everybody, I'm sure, by then. So just to give you a sense of where we are, instead of drawing my own map, I go to a 1761 map now. So here's Christ Church on 2nd Street near Market, which is right down here. And then here's where the Academy and College was, sort of at 4th and Arch Streets. And then over here is where St. Peter's still is. And so that gives you a sense of all this, the area. So now we have an incredible thing. You remember in the Liberty Tale, I talked about the First Continental Congress meeting at Carpenter's Hall, September 74, many delegates from the colonies coming with conservative intentions and then taking more radical action. Jacob Duché, as an assistant rector of Christ Church, had a role in this situation when John Adams invited him to come and lead a prayer. As he wrote to Abigail back in Massachusetts, and John Midwood, former assistant rector at Christ Church, is going to read what John Adams said about this event.
When the First Continental Congress met, Mr. Cushing made a motion that it should be opened with prayer. It was opposed by Mr. Jay of New York and Mr. Rutledge of South Carolina because we were so divided in religious sentiments. Some Episcopalians, some Quakers, some Anabaptists, some Presbyterians, and some Congregationalists, that we could not join in the same act of worship. Mr. Samuel Adams arose and said he was no bigot and could hear a prayer from a gentleman of piety and virtue who was at that time a friend to this country. Accordingly, the next morning, Mr. Duché read several prayers, and the collect for 7 September, which was the 35th Psalm. You must remember that this was the next morning after we heard the terrible rumor of the cannonade of Boston. I never saw a greater effect upon an audience. It seemed as if heaven had ordained that psalm to be read that morning. After this, Mr. Duché unexpectedly struck out into an extemporaneous prayer, which filled the bosom of every man present. Part 35 reads in part, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me. Fight against them that fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler, and stand up for mine help."
Thank you, John. And here's a stained glass window that's at Christ Church that shows this event with people down on their knees in Carpenter's Hall. The Second Continental Congress met the following year, May of '76, after the blockbuster publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which forcefully called for the removal of tyrants. And on the 4th of July, the vestry, or the governing body of Christ Church in St. Peter's, met and voted to cross out the prayers for the king and the royal family in the prayer book. This was radical action. John, what was it? Oh, so just before you start, this is a digital version of the minutes of that meeting, and it's got, you know, all the people who were there, including Jacob Duché right here. And this is what it said. Do you want to read that? Didn't I give you that?
I have the quote from Thursday, August 20th.
Okay. Would somebody like to read this? Rick, you've got the microphone in your hand. Is it?
Vestry meeting minutes, Christ Church in St. Peter's, Philadelphia, July 4th, 1776. Whereas the Honorable Continental Congress has resolved to declare the American colonies to be free and independent states, in consequence of which it will be proper to omit those petitions in the liturgy wherein the King of Britain, Great Britain, is prayed for as inconsistent with said declaration. Therefore, resolved that it appears to this vestry to be necessary for the peace and well-being of the churches to omit the said petitions. And the rector and assistant ministers of the United Churches are requested in the name of the vestry and their constituents to omit such petitions as are above mentioned. Christ Church Archives.
Great, thank you. So, wow. I think I'm missing something. Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Gotta look down here. By September of '77, the revolution was getting more and more difficult, and the British were soon to arrive in Philadelphia to occupy it and spend the winter. Duché wrote a long letter to George Washington urging him to compromise with King George and end the bloodshed. Washington was not amused, and Duché was imprisoned briefly, then left the city for London, where he stayed until after the Revolution. What we saw here was a Philadelphia gentleman, an Anglican cleric who believed in the concept of liberty in religious terms, but could not accept the radical approach that the middle sort of Philadelphia took. He didn't change, it was the revolution that did. So one of the people who was part of this radical mission to get rid of those who disagreed with their goals was Charles Willson Peale. Now, you may know about his career as a prolific, superb artist, or you'll learn about him from Harry Gratwick next week, but maybe not about his formative years. His painting skills had been discovered by wealthy plantation owners on the eastern shore of Maryland, where he was apprenticed to a saddle maker. One of them had sent him first to Boston and then to London to learn from experienced artists. In London, he met and visited with Benjamin Franklin, who was representing the colonies there, trying to get Parliament to pay attention to their demands. And he went to visit Franklin in the house he was staying in at 27 Craven Street, and Peale did this little sketch of Franklin with the landlady's daughter on his lap, Polly, maybe, nobody knows for sure, but it's there at the American Philosophical Society if you have another opinion. After returning to Maryland, he was soon painting the portraits of the upper sort, even George Washington. So in 1774, he set up a studio in Philadelphia to be closer to potential clients, and then moved with his family in June of 1776. What timing? In Boston, he had witnessed opposition to the Stamp Act. Back in Maryland, he had joined a patriot group called the Sons of Freedom. So by the time he got to Philadelphia, he was a confirmed patriot and quickly became active as one of the more radical or furious Whigs, as they were called. Then in December of 76, he joined the Associators, the militias, I talked about before, rose quickly to lieutenant, later captain, and fought with Washington at the Battle of Princeton in early January of 77. And here is a map that he made for Washington showing the British positions in and near New York. So I don't know how much you could read of that, but here's New York down here. That says Oyster Bay. Here's the Hudson going up. So, all around there. As an artist, he made maps for Washington, and he saw his painting portraits as a way to record history while it was happening. So he did miniatures while he was, being in the militia and the Associators, and he did portraits of all the revolutionary heroes, fitting the Republican ideal of a common man of the middle sort contributing to the betterment of society. And here you see portraits of, these are some of the portraits he did then of the Revolutionary War heroes. I put Robert Browne, he's not in uniform, but he basically paid for a whole lot of the American Revolution, so he was part of it. Now let me tell you about the Galloways. After the British left the city in June of 1778, Peale was one of the radical patriots charged with tracking down loyalists and confiscating their properties. Joseph Galloway was the chief loyalist during the British occupation. He fled the city for London, but his wife refused to go as she had inherited their house from an uncle and was not about to give it up to anyone. You can see from the following excerpt from her diary why Peale found it hard to get portrait clients after the Revolution, which is one reason, I think, why he turned his attention to natural science and his museum in the State House yard. So here's the two Galloways, and this is an inventory of the goods in their house that Peale wrote down when he was there that day, and July 21st, 1778. And Harry's going to read an excerpt from Mrs. Galloway's diary.
Thursday, August 20th, 1778. Mrs. Molly Craig asked for a bed for me, but they wouldn't let me have nothing. As I told them later, they acted entirely from malice. After we had been in the entry for some time, Smith and Will went away, and Peale said the chariot was ready, but he would not hasten me. I told him I was at home in my own house, and nothing but force should drive me out of it. He said it was not the first time he had taken a lady by the hand, an insolent wretch. As the chariot drew up, Peale fetched my bonnets and gave one to me and the other to Mrs. Craig. and then with the greatest air said, "Come, Mrs. Galloway, give me your hand." I answered, "Indeed, I will not, nor will I go out of my house, but by force." He then took my arm, and I rose, and he took me to the door, then took hold on one side and looked around and said, "Pray take notice, I do not leave my house of my own accord, and nothing but force should have made me give up possession." Peel said with a sneer, "Very well, madam," and when he led me to the step, I said, "Now, Mr. Peel, let go of my arm. I want not your assistance." He said he could not, he could help me to the carriage. I told him I could go without you. And you, Mr. Peel, are the last man on earth I would wish to be obliged to. Mrs. Craig then stepped into the carriage and we drove to her house where we died.
Thanks, Harry. So that's Charles Wilson Peel from a different point of view. Now I want to look at a group of Quakers with a largely unknown story of this era that illustrates the divide between conservatives and radicals. In a book published just 2 years ago, Ned Donahue, an old friend and law partner of my husband's, after doing original research during his retirement, lays out what happened to a group of Philadelphia Quaker leaders just before the British occupation of the city from September 77 to the spring of 78. Quakers in this period had the problem of being pacifists, believing that the light of God exists in every human being, and thus to kill one is against the will of God. This meant that they were accused of being loyal to the king because they refused to bear arms. They would not fight in the revolution and refused to take sides. Donahue writes, "Politics and religion are a volatile combination, whether in 2023, when the book came out, or in 1777. The same is particularly true when individual civil liberties come into conflict with a perceived threat to national security. Long the preeminent power in Pennsylvania in 1776, the Quakers found themselves out of step with revolutionary sentiments. Though the general population was well aware of their refusal to bear arms, to patriot leaders, this minority sect now constituted a mysterious, persistent, and perhaps existential security threat to the new republic and the state in which they lived." A group of 19 men, mostly Quaker merchants and community leaders, were arrested in August. They tried to protest the act, requesting a hearing in their defense, as guaranteed in British colonial law, but were sent without any trial into exile in the wilderness on the frontier in Winchester, Virginia. 2 died during the 7 months they were there, and they had little contact with their families. They were what we now call political prisoners with no trial, a total disregard for the principle of habeas corpus because of their religious beliefs and the perceived threat of collusion with the British. The order for their removal was made by the Continental Congress and the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, so that's the governing body of the state. And Charles Wilson Peel was one of the 3 radical patriots who arrested the Quakers to be removed from the city. They endured a long winter in great privation and distress, even with fellow Quakers living nearby. And it was not until April of 1778 that Elizabeth Drinker, wife of the leader of the group, and you probably noticed that this is Henry Drinker, her husband. This is another one of them. And 3 other wives of the exiles got themselves to Valley Forge, where Washington and his troops had spent the winter, and where his wife Martha was visiting. They met with her. In her diary, Elizabeth Drinker described her as a sociable, pretty kind of woman, and Martha prodded her husband, who made their release happen finally. That's an interesting story that we don't know much about, so it's good to share that with you. In the period after the British left Philadelphia in the spring of 1778, leaving the city in a shambles, With the war still going on and the middling and lower sort struggling with inflation and shortages of goods. As part of the many recriminations against Loyalists and Quakers that took place in 1778-79, upper sort lawyer James Wilson had successfully defended at trial 23 people from property seizure and exile by the radical government of Pennsylvania. He had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence and would be an important member of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. So the political situation, this is complicated, but let's give it a go. The passage of the Pennsylvania Constitution, the state constitution of 1776 created two factions, Constitutionalists and Republicans. The Constitutionalists favored its unicameral legislature, a weak executive branch, and a broadened suffrage to include any free male of 21 or older who paid even the smallest tax. Okay, this is what the radicals want. The Republicans favored a two-house legislature, a suffrage restricted to adult male property owners with a strong executive branch. Wilson was a Republican in that terminology of those days. So on Monday, October 4th, 1779, a large number of militia members met to take action against any man associated with any man associated with profiteering and sympathetic to the British. Peel was called upon to lead their march through the city to arrest and detain their enemies. As some cried out, "Get Wilson!" Peel tried, but failed, to persuade the militia to abandon the plan. Now look at, here's a map again. So here's Market Street once again. So City Tavern is right here. Remember, when we started the first lecture, I showed you pictures of City Tavern on 2nd, right near Walnut. And that's where the militias gathered. Wilson's house was here at 3rd and Walnut Streets. And then this is the Independence Hall, State House is up here. Just get you situated. In a 2014 article on the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia, which is a fabulous resource, he described the Fort Wilson riot, and I quote, "To avoid being captured by the militia as they formed up at the nearby City Tavern, Wilson and other members of the Republican Society barricaded themselves inside Wilson's house. The militia stopped near the house when one of them inside opened a window and either shouted to them to continue marching or shouted and fired his pistol at the militia. Storming the doors, the militiamen set fire to the first floor and killed the man before being turned away by the men inside." Quote. And it took the arrival of the city troop of light horse, led by Colonel Joseph Reed, president of the Supreme Executive Council, the governing body of the state, ended the attack on Fort Wilson, as it became called. This was indeed class warfare. Now, Reed was, an important person in town, and his wife, Esther, was the first lady of Pennsylvania, so she's like, the governor's wife, during the War of Independence, and led the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia with Sally Franklin Bache, the daughter of Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. In the summer of 1780, the Ladies' Association raised over 300,000 Continental dollars, around 7,500 in gold and silver. Sally Bache's home in Franklin Court, which I showed you on the map earlier, became a warehouse for 2,200 shirts the association sewed for the Continental Army. It was among the first women's voluntary association and what they accomplished. So I want to end by looking at the situation at St. Peter's Church in this period, which brings together much of what we've seen earlier. The head of the Anglican Church was, and still is, the king. Some church members were loyalists, loyal to the king and to the Penn family, which had given the land for the church to be built on, but tried to stay neutral. And that is Samuel Powell and Benjamin Chew. Powell was mayor of Philadelphia and remained neutral. Benjamin Chew, Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, sat out the revolution with proprietor John Penn in central New Jersey. Another one, George Harding, there's no picture of him, was arrested by radical patriots after the British left in 78, but was reprieved when he was on the gallows, probably with the intervention of fellow members of St. Peter's. Among the many who were the conservative patriots, that's to say the upper sort, who saw independence from England as a way to gain more political and economic power in a new country, were General John Cadwalader, John Nixon, Thomas Willing, and his business partner Robert Morris, financier of the revolution, who made much of his money on land speculation. You know, think about it. There you are on the East Coast, and there's all that land out there to buy and sell. Right? Cadwalader was one of Washington's most trusted generals and fought with him at the Battle of Princeton and elsewhere. And I figure Peel probably was one of his soldiers. You may recall that Nixon was the one who risked his life when he read out the Declaration of Independence in the State House yard on July 8, 1776. The more radical patriots mostly went to what is now called Old Pine Presbyterian Church in the next block. Although Peel is buried in the St. Peter's churchyard, he was a deist and not a member of the church, but his son, who died before him, was. So they're buried there together. Some of those mentioned above, like John Nixon, Benjamin Chew, and John Cadwalader's wife and child, are buried in the St. Peter's churchyard, as is Jacob Duché, who returned to Philadelphia in 1792 and then died in 98 and is buried at St. Peter's. And this is the tablet that tells his story, right on the east side of the church tombstone. This was a difficult time for the clergy of the United Churches. When the British left in 1778, of the four clergy, only one remained, William White, who became rector in 1779 in this really difficult time at the age of 31 and assumed Duché's position of chaplain to the Congress. White especially disliked preaching politics from the pulpit. However, in a sermon he preached in late 1775, he referred to the duty of obedience to the higher powers, but went on to say that authority does not have the right to demand obedience. Authority is valid as long as it is based on constitution and law. It is a compact between father and child, the governor and the governed, and may not be abused. Interesting.
Who said that?
William White. Going to skip that one. He went on to found the Episcopal Church, which maintained the Anglican liturgy but created a democratic structure of governance, so from the bottom up instead of the top down. He became the first bishop and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and, in case you didn't already know it, it is for him that Bishop White Lodge is named. Yeah. In 1836, he preached his last sermon from the St. Peter's pulpit and died soon after at the age of 88. He is buried in front of the altar of Christ Church. So I hope you have been able to make sense of all of this complex period today, and we'll end next week with our look at the French involvement in the Revolution. Thank you. So, any questions? Okay, yeah, I know you're absorbing all of that. It's a lot.
Are either of those graveyards still accepting people, or are they full?
The St. Peter's churchyard is accepting cremations, All the lots are full. Christ Church, I don't know, John or Gail, do you know?
There was one,
Use your mic.
there was one committal in the late 70s, early 80s. That's the last one that I'm
Really?
aware of.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it's closed, but it would be restricted to family members that still own a site.
Oh, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, and the Christ Church burying ground is at, what is that, Fifth and Arch Street. So they ran out of space around the church very quickly, so, yeah. Gail, did you want?
Memorial Garden, there's where the.
Oh, right. And there is use the mic.
In the Memorial Garden at Christ Church, which is at Second and Market, it's all common space with cremated remains.
Right, yeah,
So
so,
there's unending space.
well, yeah, good. Okay, anything else? All right, well, thank you all very much, and see you next Monday. À la France.